What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Ask Devan Anything on the Burn Bootcamp podcast. Wherever you're at in the world, I know it's January, and we are fired up, ready to go tackle this new year. And, I'm setting big goals. I know you're setting big goals. I kind of, I like that it's new year, new you. I think that's a thing for a reason. We have to be careful about, waiting until January every year before we can take action or upgrade our lives. You get to November and you might say, well, the new year's coming, so I'll just wait till then. And from November till January, I'll just blow it out of the water. Well, that's probably not the best strategy, my people, okay? And then on the micro, it's same thing. If you do good Monday through Thursday, and then you're I've done good through Monday through Thursday. It's the weekend. I'll just wait till Monday to start over again. Well, then you're going to be treading water and you're just going to be staying in the same place. And that's not a good strategy to stay in the same place. You're either growing or you're dying. And it's very important that you understand how closely correlated happiness is to your own personal progression. Meaning I'm the most happy when I'm hitting these small incremental goals. And then I'm able to, kind of have that self-proof in the moment that, hey, I didn't set my goals so big that I have to wait so long in order to feel any type of celebration, that I just set them small and incrementally. And to me nowadays, it's, and somebody had said this to me the other day, I thought it was a very nice thing to say. They said, Devan, the one thing that you've emulated is you emulate how the work itself is the reward, and you don't have to wait to get any reward. You just get to the end of the day, and you're more fired up at the end of the day than you were at the beginning of the day because of all of the things that you accomplished during that day. And if we can get to the point where we train our brain and our dopaminergic system to really fire when we are doing things like hard work, when we're doing hard, when the lift, the exercise is the actual reward, and you're proud of yourself for going through something hard, rather than saying, I'll be happy when I lose 30 pounds. You know what I mean? So there's one of two mindsets that you can have. You can wait, you can delay happiness until some X amount of time, which may or may not come in the future, or you can remind yourself of how happy you are in the hard work every day just by doing it. And and this is what I mean when I say don't chase the mountain peak without understanding that the small steps get you there. All right? So we don't want to set our goals so big that, it's basically crushing and it becomes a burden rather than something that is in place to help us visually see that progression. So the Ask Devan Anything question today comes from Lindsay Bird, and it's a fantastic question. And I thought that I would today break this down for you and just go really deep on this one question, because I know that you're dealing with this. I've dealt with this. I've got a story that I'm going to get vulnerable with, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about my life. And the question thought it was posed very, very intelligently. It said, how are you able to use your past trauma as a strength versus it becoming what causes the stumbling? Okay, well, the first question that came to my mind is, okay, past trauma. Let me think about that. Okay, that means we have to remember the past. That means we have a memory. Okay, then the question would be, what is the memory for? And to me, the way that I've always thought about this is that the memory serves its purpose as almost like a time hop, where you can jump back into the timeline of your past, and you can be able to stop in certain areas that were embossed mentally, meaning when you go through something emotionally frustrating or traumatic even, that you usually have an emotional embossment or a stamp in time that allows you to remember that experience, because it was either so fulfilling or it was so detrimental or traumatic to you. And so I'm going to share a story with you as I unpack just a few layers of this question, because it is a very deep one, Lindsay, and thank you for asking. But I think it has to start with a story, because we learn in metaphor, we learn in story, and I'm going to start telling a lot more stories during this segment because I think it will help you more. So when I think of how to separate, using your past trauma as a strength versus a stumbling block, I have to go back and I have to start at a story of mine when I was 12 years old. I've maybe said this story a couple times, but I'm going to be graphic on this, and because I think it's important for you to understand just why this is so embossed in my head. And so if you have like little kids around or anything like that, you might want to throw some earmuffs on them at this point, because this gets pretty deep. So if you know anything about me, then you know that I've had a pretty rough childhood. I grew up in Battle Creek, Michigan. And, the first 8 years of my life, my mother took me, and I would use the term drug me around the United States, from Michigan to Mississippi to Arizona to California, back to Arizona to Washington to California to Michigan, back to Arizona to Mississippi, back to Michigan. And it was just incredible how much we traveled when I was 8 years old. And then, I always missed my dad. And then, finally got back to Michigan around fourth grade. And my mom and dad moved back in together. Well, the reason they separated is because they couldn't keep their hands off each other. They were committing adultery left and right, and it was just a very toxic, the police had to govern our household. Basically, my parents were not governing the household, and so my mom did what was right, and she left, and she took me and my little brother with her. Well, we got back, and they moved back in together, and, from my recollection, it was like hell on earth right away. It was just an escalation of the physical, the mental, emotional violence that took place, and it was just it's like a really traumatic experience in general, to the point where like normal things that happen to me like aren't traumatic, because of like things like I'm about to tell you, like stories like this kind of take it to the next level. And so I grew up in what most people would call the hood. It was like a few blocks away from Section 8 housing, and I didn't have any supervision or anything like that. And so this was the time when my mom and dad moved back together. It's fourth grade. So I was, 10, 11 years old. But I remember a specific moment, really the first traumatic time in my life was when I was like 12 years old, and my mom and dad had moved back in together. And they had always fought, like physically, and it was never pretty. But there was one particular day when I was becoming, I was going through puberty. I was a young boy, like 12 and a half years old. And I was sitting on the stairs, which at my house, it's a very small house, had like these paper thin walls. And I can remember listening to the sounds of fists, like hard man fists, like connecting with skin. And I could hear the shrieks, I would call it, the screams. And I can remember sitting on the stairs as this goes on for about 3, 4, 5 minutes, and it's not good. It's escalating, it's getting worse, and I finally hear, for the first time ever, my mom scream for me. And I was already right there. I was already crying. I was like, what, like so angry. Like, if you're a little boy and you're kind of at that age where you're figuring out like what becoming a man is like, and like you're just in the preliminary steps of that, you start to experience this rage and this anger, and you really got to really control it. And I did not control it when I was 12. I heard my mom call for me, and immediately I went upstairs. She was in the corner of the kitchen, laying on the ground with blood all over her face, and my dad's still like over her. I remember him like pointing down, screaming. They both were obviously intoxicated at this point. And I come up to my dad, and for the first time ever, although I've seen this behavior with him and other women he's with and my mom, I've seen him have this behavior before. I never had the courage to stand up and do something about it. Well, I did. I stood up. I did something about it. I went up to my dad and I shoved him into the window. And I'm 12 years old, just to remind you, by the way, just a little runt. And he's a big 6'3", like, ex-professional athlete. And I'll never forget just basically getting hit right here in the side of the head, blacking out. I don't remember anything. I remember waking up and then after I woke up, I had all types of other like lacerations and like stuff on my body. Well, my mom called the police. She filed child abuse charges against my father, and that was at 12 years old. And that moment for me was, I can remember it like it's yesterday, and that moment for me was so traumatic because up until I was about 18, 19 years old, and I started thinking the way that I'm about to take you guys through in a minute, what I what I didn't really realize in the moment was that I didn't really realize how traumatic that was an experience for me, and I also didn't realize how how disdained I would be from all interaction with my family after that. It was like this flip for me to where like one moment my father is like this hero to me, like he's like Superman, right? And I was sad when I had left Michigan with my mom, and I had no idea why at the time. I was just angry at her. And when we came back, and I got in that fight with him when I was 12 years old, and he had child abuse charges filed on him, that was the first time when I realized that it was just like me, myself, and I. That I didn't have this role model, this superhero father figure that I thought I had. And also that, my mom wasn't doing anything to help the situation and was the antagonist the entire time. And so it was like this moment where I grew up just in the moment. I remember the cops arrested my dad that day. I watched it. I watched him get shoved in the back of a cop car. And I remember sitting on my couch, looking above the air conditioner, the ones that go in like the window, like peeking out the blinds, just weeping and crying my eyeballs out. Not because I was physically hurt or anything like that, because I felt like I had nobody. I felt like I was on my own. And that was, I think, the first moment when I became a man. And I was 12 years old. And that was scary for me. And I treated my life like that ever since that moment. I became a man, and it was my sole responsibility to take care of me and my siblings. And thankfully, I had a great big brother who also, he didn't live with me because he was my half brother, but he also took that same responsibility on. And, we had each other, but neither of us had parents or people that were role models for us that we could look up to. And so for years after this, I'm like, why me? Why does this stuff happen to me? And several instances from like 12 to 18, 19, 20, when similar things happened. And, it wasn't unexpected at this point. It was expected, but it was like, why me? Why? I remember crying myself to sleep, putting the pillow over my face, and screaming into it so that my dad wouldn't hear me, and then come downstairs and emotionally berate me for being a young man who's crying, who's supposed to be a man and not cry. And, it took a few years, it's up until I was 18 or 19, to redefine the meaning of what that experience really meant to me. And I realized when I asked myself the question, why do I have a memory? Like, why do I keep remembering these things? What I realized is that I have a memory so that I can go back and I can look at the past, and I can look at myself in a lens when I was less mature, had less knowledge, less perspective on the world, less self-expectation of oneself to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and move forward. I had none of these perspectives at 12 years old. And so for me, memory was always that tool that is a natural tool that was given to us to be able to go back and to be able to replay these experiences in your head and then associate a meaning with them. You can't change the experience, but you get to change the meaning that's associated with the experience. And so when I was 12, that altercation was like, I must be a bad son. I must not be pleasing my parents. I must not be, my sports must not be interesting enough to them to where they can't set a bottle down or not go out to the bar on a Wednesday. And a lot of this is my fault as a young man who, is the center of all this. Like, I was the separator, right? So like, as the separator of them two fighting that day, I took on that identity as the person, the reason, the being in which they were fighting over, even though that was never the case. And until I was about 20, and I read a book, actually. I read The Tale of Two Wolves, and I actually have a tattoo of it on my arm right here. I don't know if you can see it if you're on video here, but I have The Tale of Two Wolves tattoo, my creative rendition of it. And I read this story for the first time, and I remember I was on a bus at Central Michigan University going to like our first away game. We were going to Alabama, Birmingham, and I was making my first start. And I remember reading this story, and The Tale of Two Wolves is essentially this Cherokee grandfather who has a grandson, and his grandson asks him, the grandfather, what's the meaning of life? And grandfather replies, well, son, it's the meaning of life is both good and evil. You know, you have equal propensity for joy and happiness as you do for malice and malevolence. And so basically like good and evil, right? Like you're half good, half evil. Which one are you going to choose? And so at the end of the fable, and you guys can look this up online if you'd like to get the full rendition of it, but at the end of the fable, what it says is the Cherokee grandchild asks the grandfather, well, which one am I, grandfather? And he says, the one you feed. And so at that moment, I realized that I was both half evil, half good, and my exposure was some good, right? But it was also a lot of evil. And I think that's part two of this, right? It's like when you do have an opportunity to utilize your memory, what it's for, and to look back, to realize that no one's all good and no one's all evil, and every human being has the propensity for both in an equal capacity, and it's what you decide. It's the one you feed. Which wolf are you going to feed? The one like mine with the blue eye, or the one like I put a cross through in my tattoo design was the red eye. And if you look closely to my tattoo, through the red eye where you see this arrow, it says the one you feed. And so I leave the blue eye exposed because that's the choice that I made. Literally, guys, I remember it in this moment when I was reading that fable. I remember making the choice to only feed the good wolf. And that has been with me ever since. I mean, think about this. If you grow up watching your parents, especially father, who is your hero, go in and out of jail, in and out of prison, you know, you live in a small town and you're associated with that type of family, you know, automatically becomes your association. Your mother is somebody who is really only cares about herself and will go out of her way to create self-fulfilling prophecies that are lies that allow her to feel good about herself, thus, you know, manufacturing disdain to her entire family. Like it was a very, I was exposed to almost all evil. And I say almost all for a reason, because I learned lessons, and the number one lesson I learned in order to create a roadmap for my life using my past trauma on, you know, how to get to strength, how to use it for strength rather than continually using it as excuse or stumble block or, you know, oh, I'm like this because my past was like this. The way you do that is you have to forgive the people in your life that actually did something evil to you and thank them for all the good things that they have done. Like, my parents are by no means perfect, and either are yours, but here's what's true. You are what you are exposed to, right, to some extent. If you are born with an equal capacity for good and evil, well, then your exposure is going to push you in one way or another. You know, people who grew up watching their parents commit crimes are far more likely to commit crimes. Kids that watch their parents grow up to be alcoholics are far more likely to be alcoholics, to use drugs, to be unfaithful to their spouse. What you get exposed to oftentimes is who you become, unless you take responsibility for yourself as an individual and as an adult, and ask yourself the question, how can I use this for me rather than against me? And that one question right there, to me, is the great separator. Because my story, I understand, is a bit more dramatic than a lot of people's stories, but I also met people where their stories are much more dramatic than my story. But that doesn't mean that, you know, because I had what I had or somebody else had what they had and they had to go down their road of trauma and trouble, that you haven't had your own. Because your environment and the exposure to that environment is what shapes you in a way. Unless you become a person who allows that to shape you in both with a positive influence and a negative influence, right? It's not just, oh, it is what it is. I am who I am. I grew up this way. I was in this environment. Here's the exposure I got. Therefore, now this is who I have to be. The question I want you to start asking yourself is this who I have to be? Or who am I leaving on the table by thinking this is who I have to be? Because the way that you turn your past trauma into a strength rather than a stumbling block is actually forgiving those who actually did great things in your life who you normally would associate as only doing bad things. Like, I forgive my father for the sins. I forgive my father for the emotional, mental, physical abuse. I forgive him for going in and out of jail and prison. I forgive him for all the things that he did, all the things that my mother did. And I'm not going to dwell on those things. What I am going to do is flip that. And I am going to say, listen, I learned what not to do from you, and I thank you for that. There are so many things that you did that I would never do. I'd never do those things because I watched you do them, and you created a lesson for me that is like a premium lesson that I could only learn if I was exposed in this way. And furthermore, for all the good things you did do, for all the hugs that you gave me, all the love that you showered on me, for the confidence that you created for me, how many times you went to bat. I know you loved me. You went to bat as my parent. You stuck up for me at school those times. Like, all the times that you were there for me, I thank you for those times as well. And you'll never be able to move on and grow up and become an adult unless you yourself take responsibility for what someone else did, knowing those people would never take responsibility for it themselves. That's just powerful stuff right there. And the only way for me to move on was to forgive my dad, right? And so, hey, you beat my ass when we were 12 years old, guess what? I am one tough son of a bitch now. And there's nobody that can put me out mentally, emotionally, physically. There's no one that can stop the shine that I have. There's nobody that can deem me as a stoppable person, because I thank you, Father, for creating an unstoppable human being. It changed my life forever. That 12-year-old person became a man and is the man you see today, who is doing a lot of the things that my father did in an opposite manner, from a children's standpoint, from a family standpoint, from a faith and faithfulness to my wife's standpoint. But that day changed my life. And thank you for that day. Because without that day and without those charges that are filed in the Michigan State Court that I can go back and look at that brings me memories of that day, if I didn't have that day, I'm not half the person I am today. So thank you for that. So I will never say something disrespectful about my mother, about my father, without also saying something that I'm grateful for, that I'm happy about, and that is a nod to the love that they did have for me, because it was not zero. It was definitely not zero, and you can't just push the blame onto other people in your life and when things aren't going well for you. This is about taking ultimate, extreme ownership and responsibility for who you are and in your life. And so, there's two kinds of motivation, really. And I think if you only have one kind of the motivation, that's like the normal motivation a lot of people think about when they're saying, how do I set my goals? I called it the North Star in my book, Stop Starting Over, where it is that vision that you're running toward, right? Most people, when they think about how do I set a framework for my life, most people look out and they're like, I see a vision out there for me in the future and I'm running after that, and that's motivating. But what this philosophy does, the whole philosophy of looking at your past traumatic experiences, using the memory that you've been given to then reassociate, redefine a meaning, and use that meaning to not only eliminate the stumbling blocks in your life, but actually create strength in the moment, or strength in that story for every other moment that happens in your life, right? Conditioning yourself to say, this is happening for me, not to me. There's two kinds of motivation. There's that one, and then there's the more important one, the one you want to run away from. And this is the one you want to run away from is more powerful than the one you want to run toward. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the goal in mind that you're running toward is less powerful than the goal that you're running away from? Well, it's because you've actually experienced the goal, and you've experienced that past trauma. You've experienced that time in the past where you were able to go reassociate that meaning, to think and contemplate about it in a deep sense. And you're able to say, you're able to manufacture an ideology of something that you would want to run away from, right? So it's like, what do you want to run away from, and what do you want to run toward? And that is the push and the pull motivation that we need in order to hit our goals, right? And so the past is more powerful. I've experienced it before, but it's also more difficult to sort out. It's pretty easy to throw a vision of the future out there and then run toward that vision. It's pretty difficult to go through this process that I'm going through and to be able to say, using my altercation with my father at 12 years old, able to say, that was the most fundamentally important thing that's ever happened in my life, and I thank you for giving me an opportunity to become a man at 12 years old, because then I was a man who was able to not take care of himself at 13, 14, 15, but take care of my sisters, and to take care of my brother, and to take care of my older brother, and then ultimately the team around me. And by doing that, that gave me a leadership skill that was far ahead of everyone else in my world, and still is today. I don't know another 35-year-old leader that's doing what I'm doing, that's as convicted as I'm convicted about my people and seeing them grow. Because of this moment that I had in the past is the reason that I am who I am today. And for that, I'm so forever grateful, and I thank you and I praise you for that. Right? That doesn't mean that everything that you did I have to be in love with, or I don't need to manufacture positive, a positivity about you that is embedded in a false sense of reality. But what I do need to do is make sure that reality flips on its head, and what did happen is for me, not to me. And this is just a really intricate 15, 20-year experience that I've gone through, and the way that I think about it, trying to distill this down for you in just a few minutes here on the Ask Devan Anything podcast. And so think about that, think about that as you use your memory to isolate that most emotionally active space in your past, whatever that story is to you. Zoom yourself into that story, replay that story over and over and over, write down on a piece of paper, how could I use this for me? What does this mean? And how could this propel my life? What am I trying to run away from in this story? What is the thing that I'm running away from? And I'll tell you what, the thing that I'm running away from in that story is the feeling that I had in that moment before I knew what I know now, and making sure that my children never are even close or in the same galaxy or in the same universe of having to experience that level of traumatic experience as a young person, because we can learn those lessons other ways. I didn't have to have that happen to me to be in the mindset that I am today. And you don't have to have something happen to you that's as traumatic as something that has happened to me or somebody else. You have your own story. It could have been the one thing that your mother said to you when you were 14 years old, that one line that stuck with you for your entire life, and all of a sudden you wake up when you're 40 and you've been using that one shitty piece of advice your whole life to build the foundation of your entire life from, right? And that in itself is extremely, extremely traumatic, because it wasn't a physical abuse. It wasn't an overt mental abuse or an overt, emotional. It was a philosophy that because you were in that environment, you were given this philosophy, and you were a child, so you never questioned that philosophy because your parents are your heroes. And now all of a sudden, you get to 40 years old, and you've been living that way, and that's not the way to live. And you're still a child at 40 years old if you were honest with yourself, because you have taken what somebody else has given you, which was really bad advice, and you've used that your whole life as your framework. So it can be something just as simple as that. It doesn't need to be something extra over-the-top traumatic. I just like to use that story, and I've got dozens of those stories, but I like to use that one because, man, was that fundamental for me, and really was one of the things that I had to use my memory to go back and to redefine that meaning. So what is that to you? And the outcome of this podcast is I want you to be able to say, what are my two motivations? Okay, what is my past, or what is the runaway motivation, and what is the run to motivation? So what am I running away from in my past? What am I running toward in my future? Marry those two things, combine those two things. Now you have a push and a pull motivation, all right? And now you're able to navigate life at any given moment, no matter how fuzzy the future motivation gets, because you've already experienced that past motivation, and that push from behind is always going to be more powerful than the pull in the future. And so I'm running away from that. Every time I do a workout, I'm running away from that story. Every time I speak to my children, every time I speak to one of our 5,000 team members in Burn Nation, every time I have an interaction, there's some level of that story that is baked into all of them. And I would not be as great of a leader as I believe to be today unless that happened. So thanks. And I hope you took something away from this. Thank you for listening. Flex on that subscribe button. If this podcast hit with you, I know it's a little deeper today, and if it hit with you on any emotional chord, or you got something that you want to share, I hope you do two things. I first encourage you to share your story because it's very therapeutic. So thank you for listening to mine. And if my story helps you at all, please go to Apple Podcasts, flex on that subscribe button, all right? Because we need some more reviews on Apple. And if I've helped you out today, then please do that. Thank you guys for being here. Get your workout done today, all right? 2 claps on 2. 1, 2.